There was an experiment in Australia done some years ago called the bad apple experiment. And a researcher at New South Wales University decided to run this by sending a secret person or somebody into a meeting with a secret purpose of disrupting and bringing down the team. The researchers wanted to introduce this bad apple and study how he interacted, or she, with the team, the way a scientist, might, peer at a petri dish or observe how a poison or pathogen interacts or impacts a sample or whatnot. The most common outcomes of this bad apple are unhealthy dynamics, depressingly low energy levels, and a plummeting work ethic. In all the groups that researchers sent their bad apple to subvert, productivity fell by 30 to 40%, whether the bad apple adopted the persona of a jerk, a slacker, or a downer. But there was one barrel of apples in which the bad apple failed to spread his rot. In one meeting, every attempt at subversion failed to bring the group down. And the bad apple even found himself, despite his designated role of subterfuge, being helpful to the group. The team was engaged, maintained high energy, and stayed positive. As researchers played back the tape, they realized that there was one guy who managed to keep the good times rolling. He was quiet and even keeled. His demeanor was kind and inviting. His body language was open, and he never responded in kind to the bad apple. He was quick to redirect the negative comments and to turn them into fuel for positive engagement. This was surprising for a few reasons. One, people tend to think of intelligence and experience as the drivers of success. But it was a few simple actions that one man took that made a difference between a meeting tanking and taking off. It was also surprising how subtle these actions were. They defied the stereotypical leader molds of the bold, assertive, take-charge type who steps in and starts giving orders. This guy did not do any of that, nor did he dazzle the room with a flash of inspired brilliance and talent. And yet he quietly set up the group to do great things. Everyone is connected, and the connection is secure enough to bring out the best in people. You see, down throughout time, as we look at Scripture, God chooses people that we don't expect. They're not people who necessarily exhibit great leadership. Look at Gideon. Gideon said, hey, I'm the least in the least clan. I'm kind of so far down, I don't want to do it. And time and time again, God chooses people that we wouldn't expect. He even chooses people that, on the moral side, look at Samson. Samson demonstrated time and time again that, maybe God should have chose somebody else. But first of all, God chooses people that we would never choose, and he works through them. Sometimes they cooperate willingly, sometimes they don't. And sometimes he chooses people that are going about their life in sort of a quiet sort of way. They're not really, they don't have a vision of big things. They don't have a vision to do great things. They don't have a vision of wanting to look for these great opportunities. They're just going about their life in a quiet, simple sort of manner. That's kind of Esther. Who would have thought that God would have put a young woman in a position of royalty so that she could avert the great disaster that she does? And who would have thought that God would have even needed somebody like that in this particular position? Well, let me kind of back up for just a second and remind you of something, because I want to look at a passage in Esther. It's the famous one, and we'll see it in just a second. But I also want to remind you of the fact that God, from the very beginning, had a mission. Genesis, of course, introduces the fact that God's our creator. When he creates the first humans, he puts them into a special place, the garden, and he had given Adam the challenge: you can eat from any tree except for one, and the day you eat of it, you will die. Everything in the world and in the garden was harmonious. Everything was blessed. and everything was perfect. Well, Eve ate, gave it to Adam, and he ate, and suddenly the world is upside down. In fact, the text says that God told Adam, "Cursed is the land because of you." And so now things are different. But then he told the serpent, who was the usurper in this case, that I'm going to put enmity between your seed and the woman's seed. And the woman's seed will crush your head. So he made a promise that I'm going to take care of this. But he didn't say how. Well, of course, as we meander through Genesis, then ultimately we come to Abraham. And God chooses Abraham, and he tells him to leave the Ur of Chaldees and go to the land of Canaan. I mean, that's the shortened version, you understand, of course. And when he gets there, he tells Abraham in chapter 12, through your descendants, I am going to bless the nations and the families of the earth. I'm going to give them this land, which you're sojourning in, and I'm going to use this. And so God passed that promise then down to Isaac, and then down to Jacob, and then to the 12 sons in a way, and again in a broad sense, because he's really only going to use one son to fulfill that, and that's Judah. And even though Joseph turns out in a way to be kind of the good son, even though he was the favorite son, and I'm sure he took advantage of that situation before he ended up in Egypt. I'm sure that we all agree that he sort of became, at least from our human point of view, the best of the 12 of them. But nonetheless, God would choose Judah, and then through Judah he would choose David. But and he told David, through you, I'm going to make you a house, and I'm going to build your son is going to build a temple and sit on the throne. And even though Solomon was kind of the fulfillment of that, he was a shadow fulfillment of that. And ultimately that is in Jesus. But God's working a plan in which he's going to be a blessing to all of the earth. And he's chosen the Israelites in order to do this. Now, once the Israelites are ready to get into the land, he tells them in Deuteronomy, the latter part, that once you get into the land, I want you to be faithful. Now, God didn't expect Israel, and we should never read the covenant this way, to be perfect, and that their salvation depended upon it. God already saved them. He brought them into the land as a saved people with the covenant already in place. But the core of their faithfulness is really they're worshiping God. They're being faithful to Him. And He tells them, though, that once you get in the land, if you become unfaithful, this will happen and this will happen, and eventually I'll kick you out of the land. I'll exile you out of the land. And indeed, remember the first two commandments of the 10 Commandments: have no other gods, and don't create an idol. Because you see, even if you create an idol and claim it's God, you've still gone down the wrong pathway. The Israelites, after they got the 10 Commandments, and Moses was gone for 40 days and 40 nights, and they crafted the golden calf, and Aaron said, "Behold, Israel, the God of Israel, behold your God who brought you up from the land of Egypt." And immediately they started doing things that God didn't want them to do. And so even if you create an idol to represent the true God, you're still going to go down the wrong path. So the first two commandments tell us that God expected them to be faithful to Him. I mean, that was really the core and the key to what God chose them. But God chose Israel so that He could bless all of the families of the earth through them. And then as they got into the land, God then kind of focused then upon David, and this was going to come through David. Well, while Israel lived in the land, ultimately, of course, they began to look to other gods. And finally, after, I think it's probably near 400 years, God finally says, okay, that's it. I've had it, and so he exiles them. But he tells us, especially through Jeremiah, it's only going to be for 70 years, and then I'll bring you back. Now, when they get over into the land and they're in exile, of course, they're wondering whether or not God has abandoned them. They're wondering whether or not, God has said, okay, I've had it with you, and that's it. And this is why it's important to see where Esther is placed. Now, and it depends, I know, upon which arrangements you make, but I think that the best arrangements of the Hebrew scriptures that you have, there's the law, the prophets, and the prophets are the former prophets, which are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and then the later prophets, which are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And what you have then is the foundation of Israel's teaching in Moses and the covenant in Genesis through Deuteronomy. And the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, they tell how Israel did. Not very well. And Kings ends up with them being exiled into the land. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 are the preachers that God sent to Israel to say, hey, you're off the beaten path, get back on. And they didn't listen very well. And then, of course, in Jesus' day, there was a section called the Psalms, which starts with the Psalms, and it ends with Chronicles, and it's kind of arranged differently than it is in our day. And unfortunately, I just because of the way I do my videos, I really don't have time to put all of this up on the screen, but you can check it out and for yourself. But there is an order in which Lamentations is part of is towards the end, and then Esther, and then Daniel. And in this order, what you have in Lamentations is the lament over Jerusalem being destroyed. And at the very end, the last couple of verses in chapter 5, it's kind of, the question is sort of put, in my paraphrase, is, are you going to abandon us forever? Well, Esther and Daniel answer that, and the answer is no. Now, Daniel gives a really good answer. Daniel and his 3 friends are captured, and they're known in terms of their ethnicity. They're known that they're Jews. But immediately from the beginning, they said, we will not bow down before your ways and your gods and so forth. And God protected them, and God was faithful and helped them out. And then, of course, the end of Daniel with his visions, chapter 7 and following, Daniel shows that while the plan looks differently, it's still in place, and God is going to continue to work towards bringing blessings to all the families of the earth and the nations of the earth through the Israelites. God still has that plan in place in spite of their unfaithfulness. Now, Esther looks at it in a different way. Esther and Mordecai come at a time that's about 115 years after the exile began. And so they both were born in captivity, and their families originally decided to stay there. We don't know why. They didn't come back with Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest back in 536 BC, but they decided to stay. And then, of course, Esther, whose Hebrew name is Hadassah, her parents die, and Mordecai, who is her cousin, takes her in. So obviously he's older. He raises her as his own daughter. And then she is, of course, when King Ahasuerus goes looking for a queen replacement for Vashti, he finds, Esther gets swept up in that, but she finds favor with the eunuch in charge, and she finds favor with the king, and boom, she becomes queen. Now, did Mordecai have in mind, this is good for us, and that's why you need to keep your ethnicity hidden, that you're Jewish? I mean, did he think that, she's going to be in there and she can help us down the road? Or was he just concerned that she might be thrown out, and maybe the king might, decide to do something bad to all the Jews in the land? We don't really know, but Mordecai tells her to keep quiet. So she gets in, and she's in place, and neither one of them knows that there's a threat coming. But when the threat does come, this unlikely pair become God's necessary people, necessary chosen ones in order to avert the threat. Now, God works out his blessings through people. God doesn't just drop them from heaven. God's working all this plan out through humans. Now, eventually, we know it gets fulfilled in Jesus. He is the fulfillment of the promise, that promised blessing. But he still becomes a human being, a real human being. And for that reason, though, then we know that God works through human beings in order to bring the blessing out. But in Esther's day, that blessing hasn't been realized in Jesus just yet. And so here's what Mordecai, once he finds out about the threat, says to them. Says to Esther, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you and the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And so here, Mordecai tells us that God has placed this opportunity in Esther's lap. How many times are we going to get opportunities to bless people? We don't know. But God got this opportunity. Now, it was a serious threat. It was a very big thing. And if not averted, then all of the Jews would have been wiped out from Susa, the capital, all the way over to Jerusalem and all over the empire. And God's plan would have been stopped. But that's not what happened. And of course, so Esther, finds this opportunity, and she then, of course, assembles the Jews, and she has them fast for 3 days and 3 nights, and she prayed about it, and she said, I'm going to go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. So she steps forward, and she actually does this. And so here is this, unlikely individual. And again, God chooses people that are unlikely. Generally speaking, God chooses men down throughout there. But in the book of Judges, we have Deborah who's chosen. And now we've got Esther. Although she's pushed by Mordecai to go and do this. And so she steps forward, and Mordecai, tells her that, hey, if you don't do it, God's going to find somebody else. Now, Mordecai didn't use the word God, of course. But that's kind of what we understand is going on behind this. So Esther goes forward, and you know the story, and you know that her plan did not fail. Haman was exposed to the king, and it was the king who took out the vengeance and on Haman, had him killed and executed, and then hung on the gallows that he intended for Mordecai. In fact, I think it's kind of ironic that he builds the gallows for Mordecai, and he's coming into the court that very day that the king discovers that Mordecai hasn't been honored, intending to ask the king for permission to hang Mordecai, the Jew. And he's the one who ends up getting hanged on it. So anyway, so everything works out, and God now gets to continue his plan. And even though the people in Jerusalem, where the focus is upon God's people and the temple and God's presence, here off in the hinterland, if you will, there's a threat brewing, and God takes care of it, and he chooses his unlikely people. So God now is able to bring Jesus into the world, and he becomes the blessing to everybody, and God's mission is fulfilled. Well, almost. When Jesus dies, was buried, was resurrected, he told his disciples, now I want you to go out and tell everybody about the blessing that has been fulfilled in Abraham. He didn't put it in those words, but you understand that's what it is. And so now God doesn't automatically spread the blessing all over. He wants us to go out and to tell people about it. So I believe that we should go out, we should look for opportunities. It might be a new neighbor. It might be a coworker. It might be, a new boss. It might be a new trainee at work. It might be a new cashier at Publix or Walmart, if you like to go to Walmart. It might be a new table server at your favorite restaurant. It might be that you're in a car accident and you become, because of how things have to work out, you spend a little time with the individual that's also involved in the accident, or individuals. Or maybe you're in the hospital. There are all kinds of things that can happen where God puts you in a situation, and it's an opportunity for you to share the good news with others, to share the blessing that God created or fulfilled in Jesus Christ. There are all kinds of opportunities. We might not be looking for them. I know preachers love to talk about thinking big and going out and making your own opportunities, but sometimes for some of us who are the unlikely people, we're not powerful thinkers, we're not overtly intelligent, and we don't have big visions. We just go about our daily life trying to keep our heads down and trying to do the best we can. And I think that's what Esther was trying to do when all of a sudden she got this great opportunity. And sometimes I think that's what might happen to you as well, that God will present you an opportunity to share the blessings of Jesus that God intended for the whole world to know about. And sometimes, you might not feel comfortable in that. And that's when you need to do some prayer, just like Esther did, and find out. Maybe God will help make it a little bit more evident that there's an opportunity there. And maybe, there might not be, but maybe there is. And whether you take it or not, what's interesting is that Mordecai tells Esther, and he tells us today, that even if you don't fulfill it, God's going to get somebody else to do it. Now, Mordecai's kind of telling Esther that in a judgmental sort of way, but I think that we can kind of also look at that God is going to, God's will still be done, whether we see the opportunity for it or not. And that means then that, if I, for some reason or other, don't always do what or always take advantage of an opportunity that's in front of me. And there have been occasions, over the years where I got a contact or I got somebody and got started talking to them, and all of a sudden got distracted with things going on in the congregation. And next thing I knew, it's 3 or 4 weeks down the road, and I haven't talked to this individual. Go back and they're not interested anymore. And so then I wonder, oh man, what's going to happen to them? Well, God watches over all that situation. So if it's not me, then God will get somebody else there later on down the road. And so I have to believe that God can do it. But I also have to ask whether or not maybe God put me in this spot for this time in order to speak to that individual. And so I think we always need to explore those possibilities. So here's what I see. The Old Testament in particular shows us the fact that God used the Israelites, beginning with Abraham, the Israelites being his descendants, in order to bring blessings into the world. Now, the Israelites themselves are not the ones to bring that blessing, because they showed that they're just like all of the humanity. They were imperfect, and they failed just like any nation would have failed that God had chosen. It wasn't just the Israelites, it would have been the Moabites, or Americans, should I say. It didn't matter which nation God chose, we would have failed. And that shows the fact that we humans are not the ones to bring the blessing. So God sent his own son in the form of human flesh, who actually became one of us. And he fulfilled the mission, and he brought the blessing. But God now intends us, even though he used the Israelites in order to bring the one who gave us the blessing, Jesus. Now he intends us to be part of going out and telling people about his mission fulfilled in Jesus and the blessings that he's brought us. And so that's my challenge to you, to think about all of the situations in your life and how they might be opportunities for you to share with somebody. Now, you might not be a talking, teaching kind of person, okay, but you can be a serving kind of person. I know there are people in our congregation, they're very, very quiet, but boy, they do a lot of good works in taking food to their neighbors and in taking their neighbors to doctor's appointments or helping them out and so forth. And I'm sure those neighbors along the way find out where they go to church and the fact that they are believers, and maybe that might be attractive to them. So you see, there's all kinds of opportunities, whether we share or whether we serve. We're still then part of the mission of God to get the blessings out to all the world, so that the nations of the earth and the families of the earth will be blessed. God chose the Israelites, and now he chose the Israelites who believe and the Gentiles who believe to go out and to make those blessings known. So will you make those blessings known? Will you see the opportunities, just like Esther did, and go out and share the blessings of God, and thus fulfill or help God fulfill the mission that he started? God bless.